For 46 years, the entire world just held its breath. You had two superpowers armed with enough nuclear weapons to literally end civilization, staring each other down in a conflict that was, believe me, anything but cold. Today, we're going to unpack the Cold War, a struggle that didn't just define a century, but whose aftershocks are still shaping our world right now.
So, just try to wrap your head around this for a second. A war that involves the entire planet, with two of the most powerful empires in history, but their armies never actually fight each other. How is that even possible? Well, that is the central, bizarre paradox of the Cold War. Let's dig into how this global standoff actually worked.
Yeah, don't let the name fool you. While Washington and Moscow avoided a direct hot war, for millions of people, this period was a raging inferno. This was a battle fought in the jungles of Vietnam, the mountains of Afghanistan, and on the streets of cities all over the world. It was a terrifying arms race, a sprint to space, and a constant, shadowy fight for influence. And at its heart, this wasn't just about two countries. It was a battle of ideas, a clash of civilizations, really. You had the US championing capitalism and democracy, the free world. And on the other side, the Soviet Union promised a global communist revolution that would free the workers of the world. Each side saw the other as an existential threat, something that had to be stopped at all costs.
So, to really get this epic confrontation, we're going to trace the whole story. We'll start with how World War II allies turn into bitter enemies. Then, we'll see how that rivalry literally split the planet in two. We'll look at the moments we came terrifyingly close to nuclear war, dive into the bloody proxy wars, watch the shocking collapse of the Soviet Empire, and finally, unpack the Cold War's lasting shadow on our world today.
You know, the end of World War II should have been a moment of global celebration and peace. But instead, it just lit the fuse for an even more dangerous conflict. So how did that victorious alliance just completely fall apart? Well, the story starts right there, in the ruins of Europe.
The big three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. They were buddies when it came to beating Hitler, but that's pretty much where it ended. Even during the war, you could see the cracks forming. By the time they met at Potsdam, Roosevelt was gone, and a much tougher Harry Truman was in his place. When Truman tried to use the new atomic bomb as leverage, Stalin didn't even blink. Why? His spies had already told him all about it. The arms race had already begun. So the Soviet Red Army, after pushing the Nazis out of Eastern Europe, just, well, stayed? Country after country fell under Soviet domination. And Winston Churchill, in this incredible speech, he gave this new reality a name that stuck: the Iron Curtain. It wasn't just a line on a map. It was a real barrier of tanks and barbed wire and fear that cut a whole continent in half.
Okay, so the lines are drawn, and the conflict escalates big time. And it all comes to a head in one city, Berlin, deep inside enemy territory, and with a terrifying new weapon that had fundamentally changed the rules of war forever.
The first real crisis? Berlin, an island of Western freedom deep in Soviet-controlled East Germany. In 1948, Stalin tried to starve it into submission. He cut off all roads, all trains, everything. He figured the West would just give up. Instead, they did something unbelievable. They launched the Berlin Airlift. For almost a year, planes landed every few minutes, bringing in everything from food to fuel. It was an absolutely stunning victory for the West and a huge embarrassment for Stalin. Then, in 1949, the game changed completely. The Soviets tested their own atomic bomb. America's monopoly was over. And that kicked off a truly terrifying arms race. Both sides built bigger and bigger bombs, leading to this grim logic called mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The idea was simple. If you attack us, we'll attack you, and everybody dies. It's insane, but that balance of terror is, weirdly enough, what kept the peace. All right, now we get to the really scary part. With the world balanced on this knife's edge, the Cold War enters its most dangerous phase. These are the moments when one wrong move, one bad call, could have ended everything. East Germany was bleeding people. The best and the brightest were escaping to West Berlin every single day. So in the middle of the night on August 13th, 1961, the communists just slammed the door shut. They built the Berlin Wall. It was the Iron Curtain made real, made of concrete and barbed wire. For 28 years, it stood as this brutal scar, tearing families and a city apart. October 1962. For 13 days, the world was closer to nuclear war than it has ever been, before or since. U.S. spy planes found Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. Kennedy put a naval blockade around the island. The whole world just watched and waited as Soviet ships sailed straight for it. This was the moment of truth. And what's absolutely crazy is that deep under the ocean, the fate of humanity came down to just one man. A Soviet sub, being harassed by U.S. warships, was about to launch a nuclear torpedo. The captain wanted to, the political officer agreed, but they needed a third person's approval. That person was Vasily Arkhipov, and under all that pressure, he said no. That one decision might have saved all of us. After staring into the nuclear abyss, both sides kind of took a step back. They knew they had to cool things down. This led to a period called détente, a relaxing of tensions. But the fight wasn't over. It just shifted to new battlegrounds, where the superpowers would get dragged into long, brutal proxy wars. Vietnam for the US, Afghanistan for the Soviets. Both superpowers learned a very painful lesson. All the tanks and planes in the world can't always beat a determined local insurgency. They poured in money and lives, and both ended up retreating in failure. These wars really showed the limits of their power, and for the Soviets, helped speed up their eventual collapse. So for a little while in the 70s, it really seemed like things were getting better. Leaders were talking, signing treaties, the whole deal. But it was a really fragile peace. The competition was still bubbling just below the surface. And when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979, that whole era of détente came to a crashing halt. All right, so now we're in the 1980s, the final act of the Cold War. You've got a new hardline American president who wants to win, period. And in Moscow, a new kind of Soviet leader emerges, one who wants to save his crumbling system. Their showdown would end the Cold War in a way that absolutely no one saw coming. By the 80s, the Soviet Union was a mess. The economy was a disaster, and they were going broke trying to keep up with the American military. The new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, knew something had to change. He introduced these radical reforms, glasnost and perestroika, to try and fix the system. But instead of saving it, he accidentally lit the fuse that blew the whole thing up. With Gorbachev signaling he wouldn't use tanks to prop up the communist regimes in Eastern Europe, the people saw their chance. All across the Eastern Bloc, peaceful revolutions just swept away decades of dictatorship. And then, the big one. On November 9, 1989, the Berlin Wall, that ultimate symbol of oppression, came down. The sight of people dancing on top of the wall, it was just an unbelievable moment for freedom. Just 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself was gone. The Cold War was over. The West had won. But the story doesn't end there. The end of this massive struggle left us with a whole new world, and a legacy that is still very much with us today. Let's be really clear about something. We call it the Cold War, but for huge parts of the world, it was incredibly hot. We're talking 10 to 15 million people killed in these proxy wars in places like Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. Their lives were the devastating price of this superpower standoff. And the Cold War might be over, but its ghosts are everywhere. The eastward expansion of NATO right up to Russia's border, a Cold War echo. The fact that the US and Russia still have 90% of the world's nukes, a Cold War hangover. This new rivalry with China feels a lot like the Cold War, Part 2. To understand our world, you have to understand the Cold War. We made it. We survived. Through a mix of tough strategy, smart diplomacy, and let's be honest, a whole lot of luck, we avoided the apocalypse. The Cold War showed us that even the mightiest empires can fall, and that global war isn't inevitable. But now, as new rivalries heat up around the globe, you have to ask yourself, have we really learned the lessons from those 46 years on the brink? Our future might just depend on the answer.